I'm Melanie Abrams, and this is another special edition of The Whole Truth, How to Be an Ally. Today, we are interviewing Dr. Kira Banks.
So I am an associate professor of psychology at St. Louis University and also co-founder of the Institute for Healing, Justice, and Equity.
So first off, I'd love to discuss a photo that you shared in a training session that I was lucky enough to attend, and I wondered if you could take us through what this means and how people can use this image to understand their own advantage.
So people know this meme. It's become pretty popular. And I actually first saw it when I was a consultant for the Ferguson Commission. The Kellogg Foundation came to talk to the commission, and they were trying to get the commission to think about equity and differentiate it from equality and try to help them understand that equity is about understanding people's needs, what's in the environment, and what they need in this environment, rather than just giving everyone the same. So I think that this meme does something to help us see, okay, yeah, there's this person who's in the light blue shirt and they're shorter, they need more risers, right? But one of the critiques that I have of this is what it suggests is that we're solving for something that's inherently deficient about that individual in the blue shirt. And I think that the problem with that is it has us looking for the narratives about the individuals and what's wrong with the individuals and what we need to fix about them. And that equity is about seeing what that individual has a deficit in, and then equity is fixing that deficit. And I actually think that that's inaccurate. I think the more accurate way to think about this is this meme. And to say, I think it's important to say that culturalorganizing.org has a whole article that has dozens of different ways that you could visualize equality versus equity. There's bikes, there's all sorts of ways. And so I encourage people to consider which one resonates with them. But I use this because I think it's such it's juxtaposed to the other one. It helps people see that it's not something that we're solving for that's deficient in that person. So in this case, the yellow person, it's actually something that's different about the built landscape. Like, we have literally shaped the environment around these individuals such that we are called into accountability to give 3 risers. Not, oh, we see there's something deficient about the yellow person, and if we're nice, we'll be equitable and give it to them. No, we actually set things up this way. And it's not that there's something about them, it's about the environment. And so giving them the 3 risers is equitable. Now, we also could think about how to change the built environment, which in the long run would be great, but it requires that we understand that it's not something that's about the individual that's less than, it's about the environment and the structures around them.
My next question, most people have biases against others, oftentimes judgments made on physical appearances or deficiencies, like in that meme, disability, race, but usually these are automatic based on what we learn in our interactions or from the media or what we're taught in school. Most people don't make those judgments out of hate or intentional intolerance. And because of that, people automatically say, when discussing Black Lives Matter, for instance, well, I'm not racist. It's not a problem with me because I don't recognize those inherent biases that I have because I'm not racist. How can we teach adults who have these biases against other people? How can we unteach that I'm not racist mentality when people don't even realize that they have those biases?
Yeah, so I think that question has a couple questions inside it. And so I think one of the things I would say is when we're talking about how racism shows up, that it's really important for people to understand that it's not just about individual behavior, that it is about patterns of behavior and patterns of results that come from our policies, our practices, our norms, right? And so, for example, this moment is punctuated by George Floyd's murder. So yes, Chauvin was the one police officer whose knee was in his neck. But there's a whole pattern in history of police violence and police brutality against Black bodies, right? And so it's actually, I think, not futile at all, but it's not worth getting caught up in you're a racist, I'm a racist, who's a racist, but more to say racism is shaping how police are interacting with Black people. There's no argument with that. And so it's important to think about how do you create incentives or disincentives that make the interactions more equitable. That brings us to individual police officers, right? So people talk about, oh, well, they're just bad apples. Well, the whole barrel's rotten. people also use that example of trees and rotten apples on trees, that the tree is rotten, right? Like that we have to acknowledge how this isn't just about individual behavior, that it's individual behavior inside a system that has supported this behavior, which then leads to a pattern of behavior. And so if we can see that, I think that sometimes people don't even see how they're perpetuating racism because it's just the way that things are set up. So they've just been taught, like you said, or they have had a reaction based on what the negative narrative that's been shaped about Black people. And so it's become second nature to them. And so they don't see it. They don't notice it. And so my response is often to folks, people say we don't have a prejudiced bone in our bodies. Yeah, you do. We all do. And so it's a matter of acknowledging that and then being willing to interrupt that. And there is research on how to de-bias. There are ways that you can catch yourself in your biases and that your attitudes don't have to match your behavior. And that so your behavior can be different than your snap judgment and your attitude if you're willing to be honest with yourself about having it and then work over time to interrupt it. So I think there's a couple of things that are important for people to realize is that yes, we have to do our individual work, but that there's also systemic dynamics and patterns that we have to be on the lookout for because it's bigger than our individual actions, while at the same time holding ourselves accountable for our individual actions.
Right. And do you think that the people who argue that it isn't a police problem are even worth trying to educate? Do you think there will always be those people?
I think it's always worth trying to educate folks. It doesn't mean you have to do it every day. It might not be the day for it for you, but I don't think we should throw people in the trash. I think that the sometimes people's defensiveness about focusing on police is, they might have a family member who's a police officer or have some real defensive. And my response is often, police aren't some different species. Like, yes, police have guns and weapon and power, and we need to be thoughtful about them, but they come from our larger society. And so we can also be up in arms with how we are all engaging in racist ideas and perpetuating those. But the clear thing here is that there's some people where it might be their race, or in this case, it might be that they get to carry a weapon, right, that have power that is essential for us to interrogate, because with that power comes responsibility. And so I don't think it's a matter of not trying to educate folks. I think you just have to understand that there might be limitations, and I don't think we should engage in conversation only when we think we can convince or only when we think we can bring someone to our side. It might help you understand where they're coming from and hone your arguments and your thinking. So I think they're worth talking to.
I'd like to ask about your program, Raising Equity, which is a workshop that trains parents in how to talk to kids about equity, oppression, and justice. Do you think it's possible to train kids now so that future generations are completely devoid of biases, or do you think that some biases are inherent and unavoidable?
So I think bias from the psychological perspective, so I'm a psychologist, right? So bias, having a preference for or against something is going to happen. We have preferences in all sorts of ways, like when the foods that we eat and the way that we, interact. And some of that is evolutionary in terms of like, I have a bias against snakes who make rattle noises. Not safe, right? And so I don't think it's a matter of saying we're devoid of bias, but I do think that it's essential that we encourage our kids to be able to have a rigorous analysis of systems, because without that, they're just going to get swooped up in our thinking. So people talk about, oh, well, it'll be over when that generation dies out. No, it doesn't work like that, because we're teaching that generation our biases. So, for example, you'll see a lot of younger folks who are more open and out about being queer, right? But yet we still are seeing queer and trans youth at increased risk for suicide. What is that about? It's about the fact that the environments they're in are hostile. When they're in environments that are supporting them, they don't have those increased rates of mental health problems. So it's not going away just because the younger generation is more open. So we have to be rigorous about helping kids understand systems, understand their own social identities and that of others, if we want change. It's not just going to happen by us hoping that it's going to change. So raising equity is all about how we are intentional in cultivating that equity mindset in young people. We talk about raising equity nerds. We want our kids to be rigorous in select sports and in academics. So we should also want them to be rigorous about social dynamics.
Understanding the systemic issues which plague people in different socioeconomic or racial groups than you are in requires an incredible amount of empathy. Do you think that empathy for others is something that can be taught to us or nurtured? Or do you think that some people are just incapable of it?
I think empathy can be learned. It can be practiced. It can be strengthened, just like any other skill. Like you get better at what you practice. And so is there a small subset of people who might be diagnosed as sociopathic and lack that empathy? Yeah. Okay. Maybe. Yeah. Those are also the people like torturing animals and doing things that we would consider maladaptive in society, but that's a very, very small number. That is not common, even though our media and movies would suggest to us that it is a common thing. That sort of mindset is very rare. And so on average, I'd say empathy can be taught. Empathy can be encouraged, and it can be modeled, and people can learn to be more empathetic, and they can get stronger in their empathy, just like you can get stronger lifting weights and building strength.
If there were a piece of legislation that you could pass tomorrow to further that understanding of empathy or to encourage the teaching of children, what do you think is that piece of legislation or that next step that people can take consciously, actively to really make change?
So it's interesting. I'm not a fan of thinking that we can legislate hearts and minds. I am more of the mindset that there are things that we can legislate. So for example, if we could make sure that in schools, the curriculums are telling full histories and that we are telling full stories about and the complicated stories about our American history, for example. My oldest child is 13 and he asked me something about, well, what do you think about the looting that's happening? And I said, well, let's think about this. Like, why are people looting? We talked about the fact that some of the instigators are actually people who are not for the cause and are trying to make it look bad. I said, but tell me what happened in the Boston Harbor as our country started. That Tea Party. Okay, what was that about? They were upset about some policies and they weren't being heard, so they stole and looted tea and threw it into the harbor. That's looting, right? And we now have our country out of a moment and moments, that wasn't the only one, but it's one that we learn about in the history books that comes from that place of people fed up. And I think what happens is how we teach kids about our history is so sanitized and refuses to acknowledge the mistakes that we've made. So we keep making them and we're not learning from them. So if I were to pass a piece of legislation, it would be about making sure the curriculum was more equitable in terms of telling full stories. And it would also be around funding education in a way that is equitable. So that doesn't necessarily change everyone's hearts and minds, but it exposes people to information that is more full information. And then it's our responsibility to help young people apply that information. I think right now, so many young people, I have young people coming into my college classes and they don't even know. They just think racist people are bad and that people who are poor want to be poor. And like they have these very simplistic ideas and they don't understand how we have legislated people into poverty, that we have used access and opportunities and barriers to access and opportunities to shape people's lives in that way. That's very racialized. They don't understand how we've blocked citizenship, and we had laws that said you could only be a citizen if you were white. They don't understand the way that we have legislated racism. And then they often end up really angry. Like, why didn't anyone tell me this? Why didn't my mom and dad tell me this? Why didn't my school teach me this? And so if I could do anything, it would be to make sure they have that information so they can be critical learners earlier than college, because then I'm fighting an uphill battle and they're like, no, wait, are you telling me the truth? Well, yes, here are all these citations. Go read the history. I'm sorry that they didn't tell you the full truth. so that they could start interrupting this earlier. They could start creating a critical analysis earlier rather than being indoctrinated into this system and then being like, wait a minute, you didn't tell me. You didn't tell me the full story. We can do different, right? That's why there's the book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, right? All the ways that we've been told things, like this oversimplistic story about Christopher Columbus. Why we stay wedded to that, I don't know, right? But we have these stories and these narratives. And I think it's our inability to be willing to hold complicated truths and contradictions. But it keeps us from learning from our mistakes, and it keeps us from making progress. So I think that we can do different. We just have to choose to, because change is always happening. So why not be a part of the change that we want to see rather than just try to hold on to the way things are?
If there is one book that you could have people read on this issue, what would it be?
So my classic is Beverly Tatum's Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race. It marries some of the sociology, the discussions around race need to happen, the psychology of race and racism, racial identity, so how people think about themselves in terms of race. It brings so much into one book that there are other books that I might say, oh, this for understanding the history of how we've shaped narratives about Black people, or this book for, if you're a corporate leader and you want to talk about race, right? But I feel like that is a solid, all-encompassing starting point for lots of folks.
Great. I will pick it up. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been such a treat. Thank you for taking your time today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. And people can follow me on Instagram at Dr. Keira Banks. I'm on Facebook at Dr. Keira Banks, and YouTube and Twitter as well.
Follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Whole Truth TV, and click the subscribe button and hit the notification bell, because we've got the whole truth on the things that matter to you coming up for you soon.